Retired Lieutenant General Jonathan Conricus is a former spokesperson for the Israeli Defense Force, now a senior fellow at the Federal for Defense of Democracies, and this morning joins us from Toronto. Good morning. Welcome to our program.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
President Biden has made it very clear it is time to end this war. Biden put forward Israel's plan for a ceasefire. Now we're waiting for Israel's formal response. Do you see Israel agreeing to it?
Yes, I hope that will happen. But the real issue here is, and it's not really spoken about, is that the basic equation that Hamas is trying to achieve is return of some of the hostages for a total end of the war. And there's a problem there for Israeli civilians, and I think for the Israeli government, that as long as Hamas is in power, Israelis are not safe. And if Israel goes ahead and does such a deal, then it jeopardizes the safety of Israelis who are not yet able to return home to their communities after the atrocities of October the 7th. And there's a very delicate situation now where Israel really wants a deal and are desperate to get our hostages back, the few live ones and the many who have unfortunately been murdered by Hamas. Yet Israel doesn't want to lose the war and doesn't want Hamas to emerge victorious after the atrocities that Hamas did on October the 7th.
I just want to pick up on something that you said, that Israel is desperate to get the hostages back, because many don't see it that way. They feel that Israel has been so focused on rooting out Hamas that really the hostages have been lost. They've almost been overlooked after all of these months. They're not the #1 priority for Israel.
Yeah, I think that, taking stock of the current situation, 8 months after we still have 128 hostages in Gaza, that's a situation that I didn't think that we would be in. And it's definitely not a success of Israel to have so many of its civilians and soldiers in the hands of a terrorist organization. And I personally would have hoped for that not to have been the case and for us to have been more successful in getting hostages back and either fighting our way in and rescuing them from the hands of Hamas or having better diplomatic deals done earlier in the game. I totally understand what the families are saying of the hostages, that they want their loved ones back and they want them now. And I think it's a very legitimate claim. And on the strategic level, I think that Israel, sadly, has been manipulated by Hamas, who very cleverly used international pressure on Israel in order to delay the fighting while dangling the hostages in front of Israel and really getting Israel not to pursue the goals of the war fast enough, and in the end, still delaying the return of the hostages. So what I hope will happen is a swift deal that will not permanently end the war, where Israel will say hostages go back, Hamas gets something important in return, but at the end of it, Israel still has an obligation to its citizens to defend its border and to allow Israeli civilians to go back to their homes.
Can you give us some insight into really the political squeeze for Netanyahu? He has to choose between this ceasefire deal, which appears to have almost unanimous international support, and his own ministers threatening to resign, threatening to topple the government. How do you see him moving forward now? What are you watching for from Netanyahu in these next few critical hours or days?
Yeah, Prime Minister Netanyahu gave a statement a few minutes ago in Hebrew where he basically says that he's explaining why the proposal is a good one and that he's moving ahead, while, of course, emphasizing that there is no intention to end the war while Hamas still has military capabilities to threaten Israeli civilians. So he's trying to thread a very difficult and tight line here. Personally, I'm not so sure that his coalition partners will follow through and actually abandon the government, because I don't think that their political options are very appealing. All political polls in Israel indicate that there's a lot of support, popular support, to getting the hostages back, and that if his political partners would do so, they wouldn't bear very well in upcoming elections. And, talk is one thing, but real action is another. What Israel needs now, amidst this onslaught of Iranian terror proxies that are around us, Hezbollah in the north, Hamas in the south, hostages, rocket attacks from Iraq and from Yemen. What Israel needs is unity. What Israel needs is actually for its democratic friends around the world to step up and help it. And pressure should be applied on Hamas, on Iran, less so on Israel.
Well, the international community has been collectively crying foul to what has been happening in Rafah, the Israel offensive there, causing really a great deal of concern. I think that's an understatement. What is your response to this and how Rafah needs to be handled moving forward? Why was it important to go into Rafah from Israel's perspective?
I think it's a pretty clear situation. Rafah is the last stronghold of Hamas. We're fighting Hamas. Israel wants to defeat Hamas, and Israel needs to defeat Hamas in such a way that it's clear for Gazans the day after that Hamas is no longer doesn't anymore govern the Gaza Strip. Without taking Rafah, that will not happen. Without Israel going in and dismantling the tunnels that have been allowed to exist where weapons are smuggled in from Egypt into Gaza, Israel will not defeat Hamas, and then we will be back at almost square one the moment the fighting ends. So from a pure military point of view, politics aside, international diplomacy, US elections, Egypt, all of those topics set aside, if you look at pure, simple military logic, an enemy and Israel, Rafah needs to be taken and Hamas needs to be defeated there. Now, I am cognizant of the situation in Rafah, and, I want to tell you something that may sound odd, but the way I see the IDF fighting in Rafah currently is with one hand behind its back and the other one with a velvet glove on it. That is how gently, how slowly, how meticulously, and how carefully the IDF is fighting in Rafah, not because it really wants to, because it is being forced to do so by its allies and supporters and other countries around the world. That, in my mind, doesn't really do good, not for Israel, definitely, and not for the Palestinians, because the longer the fighting goes on, the more suffering there is, and the faster that Israel would be able to execute its aims of the war, to dismantle Hamas and to make sure that there's no incoming threat from Gaza, the better it would be for Palestinians, and the sooner we can get to rebuilding Gaza and, the so much wanted day after in Gaza.
I think I'm just about out of time. I think a lot of our viewers and a lot of people would take issue with your words that they're going about this in a gentle way, wearing a velvet glove. But I do want to ask you lastly, because again, you have a military background. Can you really destroy Hamas? I mean, you can kill fighters, but the ideology will remain. So, if I were sitting next to you on the plane and we were having this conversation and I said, really, you really think that you can eliminate Hamas? How do you answer that?
I'll answer it like this. Just like ISIS was defeated on the battlefield by a coalition of, I believe, 38 countries, it took them 2 years, lots of bombs, trillions and trillions of dollars, but eventually ISIS was defeated in Iraq and in Syria. The idea of ISIS has not yet been defeated. And I think that if we walk around the streets of Toronto and ask people today, there are still people who would espouse their ideology of a jihad-based life thinking and of trying to establish a Sharia-based entity. That doesn't mean that ISIS wasn't defeated. And I think that there's a strong equivalence here to be made with Hamas. Hamas will be defeated militarily, and they will not be allowed to continue to govern the Gaza Strip and to threaten Israelis from Gaza. But it will take lots of time, perhaps generations, to really defeat the idea or to replace the idea of crazy extremist jihadism with thinking about prosperity, thinking about coexistence and peace and security for Gazans and for Israelis. That will be accomplished with, first and foremost, a military victory, and then education, infrastructure, economy, and having an alternative to that very dark and horrible worldview that is represented by the likes of Hamas and ISIS.
Jonathan Conricus is a senior fellow. Thank you so much. He's a former IDF spokesperson as well. Appreciate your time with us today, joining us from Toronto.
Thank you.